The entire family disappeared in 1976. Then a fire pit was dug up on a neighbor's property. The rusted shovel blade struck something hard, unyielding. Not earth or stone, but a hollow, resonant thud that vibrated up the handle into Mark's hands. A concrete lid, he thought. An old septic tank, perhaps, forgotten beneath the decades of overgrowth on the property line he was finally clearing. The one that bordered the silent, shadowed grounds of the old Henderson place. A house that had stood empty, a monument to absence, since that inexplicable autumn of 1976. He'd bought the adjacent lot cheap, the realtor barely mentioning the proximity to the town's most enduring ghost story. But Mark, a man seeking quiet, had not been deterred by local folklore. Now, prying with the shovel and a crowbar he fetched from his shed, sweat stinging his eyes under the surprisingly warm spring sun, he felt the heavy slab give way with a grating groan of disturbed earth and ancient cement. He peered into the shallow cavity, expecting stagnant water, the rank smell of disuse. Instead, his breath hitched. The pit, roughly circular and several feet deep, was filled not with liquid waste, but with a dense, powdery gray ash, astonishingly fine, like the residue of a colossal fire long extinguished. And glinting dully from within that spectral dust, like unearthed relics from a forgotten cataclysm, were the ghosts of metal objects. A twisted band of gold, unmistakably a watch, its crystal face shattered, its hands forever frozen at an hour that had ceased to matter. Further down, as he gingerly disturbed the surface with a stick, blackened tines of what looked like silverware emerged, their silver plate tarnished to an almost funereal black, patterns barely discernible. Then, a larger, more distressing shape, the skeletal frame of what could only have been a family portrait, its backing charred, its glass melted into grotesque, opaque tears. The images it once held now surrendered to the ash. An almost physical wave of cold washed over Mark, despite the sun on his back. This was no septic tank. This was something else, something profoundly wrong. He knelt, his mind racing, trying to connect the grim contents with the long, silent vigil of the house next door, the Henderson place. The family who vanished. Dinner on the table, car in the driveway, lives simply snuffed out of existence, or so the stories went. Driven by a sickening premonition, he continued to probe, the stick encountering another, more solid resistance beneath the primary layer of ash and debris. Carefully, almost reverently, he brushed away the clinging powder. It was a box, a metal box, scorched and dented, but its form was intact. It looked like a strong box, perhaps, or a safe deposit container. As he worked to free it, his fingers trembling slightly, he recognized it with a jolt that ran through him like an electric current. He'd seen photographs and old newspaper clippings online when he'd first researched the area's history, articles about the Henderson mystery. The lockbox, undeniably, agonizingly, was the one reported missing from the ransacked safe inside the Henderson home all those years ago, a detail that had always puzzled investigators. Why take the box, but leave other valuables? And now, here it was, buried on what was once the edge of old Mr. Abernathy's land, the reclusive neighbor whose property stretched behind the Hendersons. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken years, of secrets interred as deeply as this horrifying pit. The silence of the woods around him suddenly seemed to press in, no longer peaceful but filled with an invisible, watching presence. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his stomach, that he had stumbled upon something more than just forgotten refuse. He had unearthed a grave, not of bodies perhaps, but of a story, a truth that had lain dormant for nearly half a century, waiting for the turn of a shovel, the curiosity of a new arrival, to bring its terrible contents into the light. The sheer deliberateness of it, the burning, the burying, spoke of a desperate act, a violent erasure. What horrors had this small patch of earth witnessed? What secrets had it kept, locked beneath layers of soil and time, while the world moved on, while seasons turned, while the Henderson house slowly surrendered to decay and legend? The weight of it felt immense, a burden passed from the earth itself into his own unsuspecting hands. The initial shock gave way to a profound sense of unease, a creeping dread that settled into Mark's bones. He backed away from the pit, his gaze fixed on the disturbed earth, the exposed concrete, the grim testament within. The woods, moments before a backdrop to his mundane task of clearing land, now seemed to hold their breath, the rustling leaves whispering forgotten names, forgotten fears. The Henderson family. Arthur, the father, a quiet man who worked at the local bank. Eleanor, his wife, known for her garden and her gentle smile. Thomas, 10 years old, a lover of comic books and treehouses. And little Lily, barely 7, with her bright red ribbons and infectious laugh. They had vanished on a Tuesday, October 19, 1976. The police reports, which Mark had morbidly skimmed through online, painted a picture of eerie domesticity frozen in time. Dinner laid out on the kitchen table, pork chops and green beans growing cold. School bags dropped by the door. The television in the living room tuned to the evening news. Its screen dark, but its phantom voice still echoing in the official narrative. No signs of struggle, no ransom note, no witnesses, just an empty house, a family erased. The car, a sensible Ford sedan, sat in the driveway, keys in the ignition. It was as if they had simply evaporated, leaving behind only questions that festered in the town's collective consciousness for decades. Theories abounded, of course. They had run away, started a new life, perhaps to escape debts or some hidden scandal. They were victims of a robbery gone wrong, though little of value seemed to be missing beyond the lockbox. Alien abduction, some whispered in hushed tones, half joking, half fearful. But the most persistent, most chilling theory was that they had met with foul play, their bodies hidden so well that not a trace was ever found. Until now, maybe. Mark fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy. Who did he call? The police, obviously. But the enormity of it, the resurrection of this decades-old tragedy, felt overwhelming. He imagined the sirens, the investigators, the media descending upon his quiet piece of land, turning it into a spectacle. Yet, the image of the melted picture frame, the twisted watch, the ashes of a life, or lives, demanded action. This was not his secret to keep. He dialed 911, his voice surprisingly steady, as he explained what he had found, the words sounding surreal even to his own ears. A fire pit, buried on the old Abernathy property line, next to the Hendersons, filled with burned items and a lockbox. The dispatcher on the other end, initially calm, grew quiet, her tone shifting, as the significance of the names and the location registered. The Hendersons. Even now, nearly 50 years later, the name resonated with a dark, local fame. While he waited, Mark couldn't stop his eyes from drifting back to the pit, and then to the looming silhouette of the Henderson house, through the trees. It stood there, 2 stories of peeling paint and boarded-up windows, a silent sentinel that had guarded its secrets for so long. Did it know? Had it somehow been aware of this nearby earthen tomb all these years? Old man Abernathy, the neighbor, had died in the late 90s, a recluse to the end. Mark recalled snippets from the online forums. Abernathy was strange, kept to himself, had a reputation for being cantankerous. Was he involved? Or had someone else used his remote property line, shrouded by woods, as a convenient disposal site? The questions swirled, heavy and dark as the ash in the pit. The discovery had pierced the veil of ordinary life, exposing something ancient and terrible beneath. The past was never truly dead, he realized. It was merely buried, waiting. And sometimes it clawed its way back to the surface, demanding to be seen, to be heard, its silent screams finally finding a voice in the rustle of disturbed earth and the glint of long-lost metal. The approaching wail of a distant siren was a mournful sound, a lament for a tragedy whose final act was only now beginning to unfold. The first patrol car arrived, kicking up dust on the unpaved track that led to Mark's property. 2 officers, young, faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and solemnity, listened as Mark recounted his discovery, his voice still raw with the shock of it. They peered into the pit, their expressions hardening. One made a call, his voice low, urgent. Soon, more vehicles arrived. Detectives, forensic specialists, their movements purposeful. A stark contrast to the idyllic quiet of the surrounding woods that had been so violently interrupted. Yellow tape was unspooled, cordoning off the area, transforming Mark's backyard project into a crime scene, a place suddenly imbued with a grim sanctity. The Henderson case. For the older detectives, it was a legend, a ghost story from their own childhoods, or the defining unsolved mystery of their early careers. For the younger ones, it was a file gathering dust in the archives, a testament to the limits of justice, the persistence of the unknown. Now, it was alive again, pulsing with a terrible, newfound relevance. News, it seemed, traveled fast in a town starved of such grim excitement. Local reporters began to gather at the edge of the police tape, microphones outstretched, cameras hungry for images. Mark, retreating to his small cabin, felt like an unwilling participant in a play he had not auditioned for. He watched as the forensic team, clad in white suits, began their meticulous work, their actions precise, almost reverent, as they sifted through the ashes, photographing, cataloging. Each blackened spoon, each warped piece of metal, was treated as a sacred relic, a fragment of a shattered life. The Henderson house itself seemed to draw their attention. Officers walked its perimeter, their gazes sweeping over the decaying facade, the overgrown yard where Eleanor Henderson's roses had long ago surrendered to weeds. The house had been sold and resold over the years, but no one ever stayed long. It was as if the lingering sorrow, the unanswered questions, had seeped into the very foundations, making it uninhabitable. Whispers of it being haunted were common. The laughter of children heard on moonless nights, a woman's sorrowful sigh carried on the wind. Now, those whispers felt less like fanciful tales and more like echoes of a truth too terrible to comprehend. The discovery of the pit, of the lockbox, lent a terrifying credibility to the darkest theories. This wasn't a family who had simply left. This was a family who had been violently, methodically erased. The items in the pit, personal, intimate, suggested a desperate attempt to obliterate their identities, their history. Why burn a watch, a picture frame, silverware, unless you wanted to ensure nothing remained, nothing could be traced? The local historical society, contacted by one of the detectives, confirmed the lockbox was indeed identical to the one reported stolen from Arthur Henderson's study safe. It had supposedly contained important papers, perhaps some cash, family heirlooms. Its theft had been one of the few concrete clues in an otherwise bewilderingly empty scene. The fact that it was found here, buried with other burned possessions, painted an even more sinister picture. It suggested the robbery was a smokescreen, or part of a larger, more brutal narrative. The air crackled with unspoken assumptions, with the dawning horror that the Hendersons had not only been killed but that their final moments, or their remains, had been consumed by fire, their essence reduced to this pathetic pile of ash and twisted metal. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. The work around the pit continued under harsh floodlights, a stark, artificial glare in the encroaching twilight. The woods watched, impassive, holding on to the secrets of that night in 1,976 secrets that were now being painstakingly exhumed, fragment by painful fragment. The question of Mr. Abernathy, the former owner of this land, loomed large. Had he been the monster living next door, his reclusiveness a cover for an unspeakable darkness? Or was his property merely a convenient, secluded dumping ground for a killer who knew the woods, who knew how to make things disappear? The silence from the Henderson house felt heavier now, more accusatory. It had witnessed something. It knew, and perhaps, after nearly 50 years, it was finally ready to share its terrible burden. The news of the discovery spread through Oak Haven like wildfire, through dry grass, crackling along phone lines, igniting social media feeds, whispered in grocery store aisles and over coffee cups at the local diner. The Henderson family, back from the abyss of forgotten tragedies, thrust once more into the harsh glare of public consciousness. For many, It was the reopening of an old wound, a collective trauma that had never truly healed, only scabbed over with the passage of time. And for one woman, in a quiet nursing home 2 towns over, the news arrived like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her frail lungs. Clara Mayhew, Eleanor Henderson's younger sister, was 87 years old. The years had bent her spine and clouded her eyes with cataracts, but her mind remained sharp, a repository of memories, both cherished and excruciating. For 47 years, Clara had lived with the ghost of her sister, her brother-in-law, her niece, and nephew. She had attended every fruitless press conference, hounded every new detective assigned to the cold case, offered rewards she couldn't afford, and prayed nightly for a resolution, any resolution, even the one she most dreaded. The not knowing, she often said, was a special kind of torment, a gaping void that hope and despair waged endless war within. When a kindly nurse, holding Clara's trembling hand, gently told her about the discovery on the old Abernathy property, about the fire pit, the burned belongings, the lockbox, Clara closed her eyes. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, then another. It wasn't the shock of surprise, it was the terrible weight of vindication, the confirmation of her deepest, darkest fears. They hadn't run away. Eleanor would never have left without a word, not to her. They had been taken. They had been harmed. The burned objects, Eleanor's mother's silver, Arthur's retirement watch he was so proud of, perhaps even a melted toy soldier belonging to Thomas, or a tiny, scorched doll shoe from Lily. Each imagined item was a fresh stab of pain. The lockbox. Clara remembered Eleanor mentioning it, a place for important papers, for sentimental keepsakes. Its presence in that horrifying pit felt like a desecration of their most private sanctum. The police had promised to keep her informed. A detective, a young woman with kind eyes named Miller, had called personally, her voice gentle but firm, explaining the process, the painstaking work of sifting through the ashes, of examining the lockbox. It would be opened carefully, she said, by experts. They hoped it might contain something, anything, that could finally shed light on what happened to the Hendersons. Clara listened, numb. Hope, that tenacious, battered thing, flickered faintly. Could this be it? After all these years, could the truth finally surface from that unholy ground? She thought of Abernathy, the strange, solitary man who had lived next door to Eleanor and Arthur. He had always made her uneasy on her infrequent visits, with his staring eyes and his unkempt yard, a stark contrast to Eleanor's meticulous garden. Had he been capable of such monstrousness? The town had dismissed him as an eccentric, harmless, but evil, Clara knew, often wore mundane masks. The thought of her sister and her family suffering at the hands of someone so close, someone whose presence was a daily fixture in their lives, was almost unbearable. As the forensic teams continued their work under the glare of floodlights, meticulously excavating the past, Clara sat in her quiet room, the hum of the nursing home, a distant drone. She clutched a faded photograph, one of the few she had left. Eleanor, Arthur, Thomas, and Lily, smiling, frozen in a moment of sunlit happiness, forever young, forever innocent. The contrast between that bright image and the grim reality being unearthed miles away was a chasm of grief that threatened to swallow her whole. The wait for news about the lockbox's contents stretched before her, an eternity packed into hours. Each tick of the clock, a reminder of the decades stolen, the lives lost, the justice so long delayed. Yet, amidst the pain, there was also a sliver of something else, a grim determination. The truth, no matter how terrible, was better than the suffocating silence of the unknown. The dead deserved their story to be told, and she, Clara, the last one left to remember them so vividly, would be there to hear it. The lockbox, scorched and scarred, sat on a sterile stainless steel table in the county forensic lab. It was an object of intense focus, a potential Rosetta Stone for a mystery that had confounded generations. Detective Miller stood by, alongside a seasoned forensics chief, and a specialist in historical artifacts and document preservation. The air in the lab was cool, controlled, a stark contrast to the humid, emotion-laden atmosphere at the excavation site. Every fleck of ash, every microscopic fiber adhering to its heat-warped surface, had been collected and catalogued. Now, the moment had come to see what secrets it held within, if any had survived the inferno that had consumed the other items in the pit. The specialist, a woman with deft, careful hands and eyes magnified by protective goggles, began her work. There was no key. The lock was fused, partially melted. Entry would have to be forced, but with surgical precision to minimize damage to any potential contents. The silence in the lab was broken only by the soft whir of ventilation and the occasional metallic click of the specialist's tools. Miller found herself holding her breath, a knot of anticipation tightening in her chest. She had spent weeks immersed in the Henderson case files, the faded photographs of the smiling family, the sparse, frustratingly inconclusive evidence from 1976. This felt like the closest anyone had come to a breakthrough in nearly half a century. The specialist worked slowly, methodically, bypassing the ruined lock mechanism. There was a final, subtle snap, and the lid, resisting slightly as if reluctant to give up its long-held secrets, was prized open. A faint smell, acrid and old, wafted out, the scent of burned material, of aged paper, of time itself. Inside, nestled against the fire-blackened metal, was a small, surprisingly intact bundle. It was wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, or perhaps heavily waxed canvas, the outer layers of which were singed and brittle but had largely protected what lay within. The specialist carefully lifted the package. It was surprisingly light. With tweezers, she began to unpeel the charred layers of the protective wrapping. Beneath them, astonishingly, lay a sheaf of papers. They were yellowed, brittle at the edges, and bore water stains that had likely occurred long before the fire, perhaps from humidity within the box over the decades. But they were legible. And on top, in faded but elegant handwriting that Miller recognized from samples of Eleanor Henderson's correspondence in the old files, was a single, chilling sentence, an address to the future, to the unknown, to whoever finds us. A collective intake of breath in the room. This wasn't just important papers or heirlooms. This was a message, a testament, perhaps a confession, or an accusation, penned by a hand that had long since turned to dust. The specialist carefully separated the first page. The writing was cramped, hurried, as if written in great distress or haste, yet the loops and curls of Eleanor's script were unmistakable. Miller leaned closer, her heart pounding. This was it. The voice of the past, finally speaking. The first few lines were a blur of emotion. A mother's love and fear poured onto the page. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened. Our lives, as we knew them, are over. They will say we ran, perhaps, or that some terrible accident befell us. But it will be a lie. Miller felt a chill crawl up her spine. The words were a direct refutation of all the hopeful theories, a confirmation of the darkest suspicions. The letter was dated October 18, 1976, the day before they vanished. Written on the very precipice of their doom. The specialist continued to turn the fragile pages, each one handled as if it were made of spun glass. There were several sheets filled with Eleanor's script. It wasn't a long document, perhaps 5 or 6 pages, but its emotional weight felt immense. The silence in the lab was absolute now, save for the rustle of ancient paper. The story of the Hendersons, their final days, their fears, their knowledge of their impending fate, lay there on the table, waiting to be fully unveiled. The relief of finding something so significant was immediately tempered by a profound sense of dread. What horrors would these pages describe? What darkness had Eleanor Henderson felt compelled to record in her family's final hours? The town of Oak Haven, Clara Mayhew, the detectives, the entire community haunted by this mystery, they were all about to learn the truth. And Miller suspected, with a certainty that made her blood run cold, that the truth would be far more terrible than any fiction they could have imagined. Eleanor Henderson's voice, silent for nearly 5 decades, began to speak from the fragile, yellowed pages, each word a drop of ice water on the heated anticipation of the investigators. Detective Miller read, a transcript carefully prepared by the preservation specialist, the original pages too delicate for repeated handling. The letter began not with an accusation, but with a mother's tender, desperate love. My dearest Thomas, my sweet Lily, Eleanor had written, her usually neat script now sprawling, erratic, a testament to the tremor in her hand, the terror in her heart. If you are ever old enough to understand these words, know that your father and I loved you more than life itself, more than this life they are threatening to take from us. We tried to protect you. We tried to find a way out, but the shadows grew too long, too close. The shadows, a recurring motif in the first few pages. Eleanor wrote of a growing unease, a sense of being watched, of ordinary things taking on sinister new meanings, a misplaced garden tool appearing on their porch, silent phone calls in the dead of night, the feeling of eyes on her back as she hung laundry in the yard. At first, Arthur dismissed it as my nerves, she wrote. Our town is safe, he would say. People are good here. But then he started to see it too. The way Mr. Abernathy, our neighbor, would stare. Not just a casual glance, but a fixed, unblinking regard, like a predator watching its prey. His smiles, once rare but benign, became something else, something cold and knowing. Mr. Abernathy, the reclusive man whose property now held their makeshift tomb. The letter painted a chilling portrait of his escalating strangeness. He began to appear at odd hours near their property line, sometimes just standing there in the twilight, motionless, a dark silhouette against the fading light. He started making comments, veiled threats disguised as neighborly concern. He spoke of the woods, of how easily things could get lost there. People, too. He'd say it with that strange smile, his eyes never leaving Arthur's, or mine. Eleanor recounted an incident where their cat, Marmalade, disappeared for 2 days, only to return traumatized, a patch of fur inexplicably shaved from its back. Abernathy had commented the next day, animals know when to be afraid. Smart ones learn to stay quiet. The implication was not lost on them. They had considered going to the police, Eleanor wrote, but what could they say? That their neighbor was peculiar? That he made them uncomfortable? There was no concrete proof, only a creeping dread, a web of subtle intimidation that was slowly tightening around them. Arthur confronted him once, told him to stay away from us, from our children. Abernathy just laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He said some folks just don't know what's good for them, digging where they shouldn't. We never knew what he meant. Arthur had no dealings with him, no disputes, or so Arthur believed. The letter hinted that Arthur might have stumbled upon something of Abernathy's, some secret the man was desperate to protect, though Eleanor herself seemed unsure of its nature. Perhaps it was an accidental discovery, something seen or overheard that marked them. The fear became a constant companion, Eleanor confessed on the brittle paper. It poisoned everything. The children felt it, though we tried to shield them. Thomas stopped wanting to play in the woods behind our house. Lily started having nightmares, crying out about a shadow man. Miller paused, looking up at the faces in the room. The clinical atmosphere of the lab felt suddenly charged, heavy with the raw, unfiltered terror of a family cornered. This wasn't just a record of events, it was a descent into a private hell, meticulously documented by a woman who knew her time was running out. The Hendersons hadn't been random victims. They had been targeted, stalked, their lives unraveling thread by terrifying thread at the hands of the man who lived just a stone's throw away, a man the rest of the town had dismissed as merely an oddity. The banality of the evil made it all the more horrifying. The letter continued, each sentence building upon the last, painting a suffocating picture of the Hendersons' final days. Eleanor described a growing isolation, a sense that they were trapped. We talked of leaving, she wrote, her script becoming more frantic, more desperate. Packing a few things, just driving away in the night. But where would we go? He knew Arthur's routines, where he worked. He knew the children's school. It felt like he was everywhere, his presence a suffocating blanket. We felt like insects in a jar, and he was the child outside, watching, waiting to tap on the glass. There was a chilling section detailing how Arthur had tried to secure the house, adding new locks to the doors and windows, sleeping with a baseball bat beside their bed. But these measures felt futile against an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move, whose menace was more psychological than overtly physical, at least initially. "He wants something from us," Eleanor wrote, a chilling certainty in her words. "Something Arthur has, or something Arthur knows. Arthur won't tell me everything, to protect me," he says. "But I see the fear in his eyes, a fear I have never seen there before. He is a good man, my Arthur, a strong man, but he is breaking." The letter detailed a specific encounter just days before their disappearance. Abernathy had approached Arthur in their driveway, under the guise of returning a borrowed newspaper. His words, as recalled by Eleanor, were laced with a quiet, confident menace. He told Arthur that some secrets are best kept buried, that digging them up can unleash things best left undisturbed. He talked about loyalty, about how some people don't understand its importance. Then he looked towards the house, towards the window where I was watching, and he smiled again, that awful, knowing smile. It was then I knew we were truly in danger. This wasn't just about property lines or neighborhood squabbles. This was something deeper, darker. Eleanor's narrative then shifted to the lockbox itself. "Arthur has put this letter and other important papers in the family lockbox. He says if anything happens to us, this might be the only way for the truth to come out. He plans to hide it or give it to someone for safekeeping. But who can we trust? It feels as if his shadow touches everyone in this town now." The terrible irony of the lockbox being found in Abernathy's fire pit was not lost on Detective Miller. Abernathy hadn't just killed them. He had seemingly found and co-opted their final message, their attempt to cry out from beyond the grave, and tried to destroy it along with their other possessions. Only the oilcloth wrapping and perhaps a fluke of the fire had preserved it. The final page of the letter was almost unbearable to read. It was smudged, as if by tears, the handwriting nearly illegible in places. "He came to the house tonight. While the children were sleeping, Arthur confronted him. There was shouting, terrible sounds. Arthur, I think Arthur is hurt. Abernathy is not just a man. He is a monster. He says we have to go with him, that he has a place prepared. Oh God, my children, my babies, if anyone finds this, please tell the world what he did. Don't let him erase us. Don't let him win. Remember the Hendersons. Remember us." The letter ended there, abruptly, as if Eleanor had been interrupted, the pen falling from her hand mid-sentence. The place prepared, the fire pit. The words hung in the air, heavy with their horrific implication. The Hendersons hadn't just been murdered. They had been led to their execution site, perhaps under duress, by the neighbor they had come to fear so intensely. The premeditation, the cold, calculated cruelty of it, was staggering. Miller closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of Eleanor Henderson's final testament pressing down on her. The mystery of what happened to the Hendersons was solved. But the horror of it, the intimate, neighbor-against-neighbor betrayal, was a fresh wound, raw and bleeding despite the nearly 50 years that had passed. The silence in the lab was profound, broken only by the quiet hum of machinery, a stark counterpoint to the screams that echoed from those fragile, ink-stained pages. The contents of Eleanor Henderson's letter ripped through Oakhaven with the force of a long-delayed earthquake, shattering the remaining illusions of peace and quiet that the small town had clung to for decades. The full, horrifying truth, relayed by authorities with as much sensitivity as the grim facts allowed, was far worse than the vague specter of an unknown killer or a tragic accident. This was a betrayal of the most intimate kind. A neighbor, a familiar face, a man who had lived among them, revealed as a monster. Mr. Mate Abernathy, long dead, his overgrown property now a confirmed charnel ground, became a figure of posthumous infamy. The townspeople who remembered him, his reclusive nature, his unkempt appearance, his occasional unsettling remarks, now saw those memories through a new, terrifying lens. Every odd glance, every curt response, every moment of discomfort he had caused was re-examined, imbued with a sinister significance. Had they missed the signs? Could they have done something? These questions, unanswerable and agonizing, hung heavy in the air. The fire pit, now excavated and exposed, became a dark shrine. People drove by slowly, their faces grim, some leaving flowers at the edge of the police tape, small tokens of grief and apology for a family so terribly wronged, so long unmourned in truth. The burned remnants of their lives, the watch, the silverware, the melted frame, were no longer just objects. They were symbols of a calculated, brutal erasure. The realization that the Hendersons had known their killer, had lived in terror of him in their final days, added a layer of profound tragedy. Eleanor's letter, excerpts of which were guardedly shared with the public, painted a portrait of a family descending into a nightmare, their pleas for help unvoiced or unheard until it was too late. Her final words, desperate and defiant, resonated deeply. Remember the Hendersons. Remember us. The town vowed to do just that. The local historical society began planning a permanent memorial. The old Henderson house, once a symbol of mystery and decay, was now viewed with a new sense of sorrow and sanctity. There was talk of preserving it, of turning it into a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the most ordinary surfaces. For Detective Miller and her team, the work was far from over. Though Abernathy was beyond the reach of earthly justice, the investigation continued, seeking to understand the why. What secret had Arthur Henderson stumbled upon? What had driven Abernathy to such monstrous lengths? They delved into Abernathy's past, a difficult task given his reclusive nature and the passage of time. There were whispers of illicit activities, of hidden caches on his large wooded property, but concrete evidence was scarce. Perhaps his motive had died with him, a final, frustrating piece of the puzzle, forever lost. The letter implied Abernathy hadn't acted entirely alone, or at least hinted at a broader network of fear he might have been part of. With phrases like digging where they shouldn't, and his talk of loyalty. But these were shadows, too indistinct to grasp. The immediate focus, however, was on the confirmed horror, Abernathy's calculated destruction of the Henderson family. The letter, coupled with the contents of the fire pit, provided a chilling narrative. He hadn't just killed them, he had tried to unmake them, to burn away their existence, their memories, their very identities. The fire pit was not merely a grave, it was an incinerator designed to obliterate every trace. That the lockbox and Eleanor's courageous letter had survived was a miracle, a testament to her desperate will, a final act of defiance against the man who sought to silence them forever. The earth itself, it seemed, had refused to keep his secret completely. For Clara Mayhew, the unveiling of Eleanor's letter was both a devastating blow and a profound, sorrowful release. Detective Miller, accompanied by a grief counselor, visited Clara in person, reading the letter to her gently, allowing her time to absorb each painful revelation. The words of her sister, so full of love for her children and terror of her tormentor, were almost unbearable. Clara wept, silent tears streaming down her face, clutching the detective's hand as if it were a lifeline in a storm of resurrected grief. To know, with certainty, the fear Eleanor had endured, the horror of their final hours, was an agony she had dreaded for nearly half a century. Yet, mixed with the pain, was a strange, bitter solace. The not knowing was over. The endless loop of questions, the haunting possibilities, had finally resolved into a single, terrible truth. Her sister had been brave. Her sister had fought, in the only way she could, to leave a testament. She was always the strong one, Clara whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion, looking at a faded picture of Eleanor. Even at the end, she was thinking of how to make him pay, how to tell the world. The confirmation of Abernathy as the architect of their demise brought a cold, hard anger. Clara remembered him vividly now, the way his eyes would linger too long, the subtle shift in his demeanor that she had dismissed at the time as mere eccentricity. Guilt gnawed at her. Had she, too, missed signs? Could she have done more? The counselor assured her that such blame was a natural response, but that the evil belonged to Abernathy alone. The community of Oakhaven, shamed and horrified, rallied around the memory of the Hendersons. A memorial service was planned, not a funeral, for there were no bodies to bury in the traditional sense, only the ashes and the scorched remnants of their lives, and Eleanor's indelible words. The townspeople, strangers, and those who held faint memories of the family came together, their shared grief a balm for the decades of silence and speculation. Clara, frail but resolute, attended the service. She spoke, her voice trembling but clear, of Eleanor's kindness, Arthur's quiet strength, Thomas's adventurous spirit, and Lily's bright laughter. She read a small portion of Eleanor's letter, the part where she spoke of her love for her children, ensuring that Eleanor's voice, her maternal love, was heard one last time, clear and pure, above the horror. The unanswered questions about Abernathy's ultimate motive, whether he had accomplices or what specific secret Arthur might have unearthed, lingered. But for Clara, these were secondary to the core truth. Her family had been stolen from her by a man consumed by darkness. The discovery of the letter, the lockbox, the pit, it hadn't brought them back. It wouldn't erase the years of pain, the void they had left. But it brought a form of closure, a brutal, heartbreaking closure, yet closure nonetheless. The ambiguity was gone. The ghosts of uncertainty could finally rest. She knew now that her sister, in her final desperate hours, had been thinking not just of survival, but of truth and remembrance. And in that, there was a small, fierce victory. The pit on Abernathy's old land was eventually filled, the ground consecrated. But it would forever remain a scar, a reminder of the day the earth gave up its dead, and a family's silent screams were finally heard. Clara knew she would carry the sorrow for the rest of her days, but now it was a sorrow illuminated by truth, a truth her sister had risked everything to ensure would one day see the light. The seasons turned over Oakhaven, and the raw wound of the Henderson family's rediscovered tragedy began to slowly knit into the town's deeper, more permanent tapestry of memory. The initial shock and horror gave way to a quieter, more reflective sorrow, a collective understanding that some darknesses are never fully expunged, only acknowledged and carried. The firepit on the edge of what was once Abernathy's land was now marked by a simple, unadorned stone, engraved with the names Arthur, Eleanor, Thomas, Lily. And beneath them, a single line from Eleanor's letter, chosen by Clara, "Remember us." It wasn't a place of pilgrimage for the ghoulishly curious, but a quiet spot where townsfolk sometimes left wildflowers, a silent testament to a promise kept. The Henderson house itself, no longer just a spooky landmark, became something more poignant. A local benefactor purchased it, not to live in, but to carefully restore its exterior to how it looked in 1976, its yard tended, Eleanor's rose bushes replanted from old photographs and Clara's memories. It stood not as a monument to horror, but as a gentle defiance against erasure, a quiet insistence that this family had lived, had loved, had mattered, before their lives were so cruelly extinguished. The national news eventually moved on to other stories, other tragedies. But in Oakhaven, the Henderson case remained a defining narrative, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation to the next, a reminder of the fragility of peace and the importance of vigilance. Detective Miller often found herself driving past the Henderson house or the memorial stone, a sense of profound melancholy washing over her. The case had solved a mystery, but it had also unearthed an almost unbearable weight of human cruelty. Eleanor's letter, a copy of which she kept locked in her desk, was a stark reminder of the courage that can bloom even in the face of unimaginable terror. Clara Mayhew lived for another 2 years, her remaining days imbued with a quiet peace that had eluded her for nearly half a century. She had the truth. It was a terrible truth, but it was hers, and it was Eleanor's. She visited the memorial stone often, sometimes talking softly to the names etched there, sharing small snippets of her day, keeping their memory alive in the most personal of ways. When she passed, she was buried beside her own parents, but a small inscription was added to the Henderson Memorial, noting her unwavering love and lifelong search for her sister's family. The full extent of Abernathy's motives, the something Arthur Henderson might have stumbled upon, remained partly shrouded in the mists of time, a chilling testament to the secrets some men take to their graves. Perhaps it was a hidden fortune, a connection to organized crime, or simply a mind consumed by a possessive, paranoid darkness. The official investigation concluded that Abernathy, driven by a desire to protect a deeply guarded secret and a sociopathic need for control, had systematically terrorized and ultimately murdered the Henderson family, attempting to incinerate their remains and possessions to ensure his crime remained undiscovered. His death years earlier was its own unsatisfying end to that particular thread. The lockbox and the letter within became Oakhaven's most precious, sorrowful artifacts. They spoke of a time when evil lived next door, unnoticed by most, until it consumed an innocent family. But they also spoke of a mother's enduring love, a desperate, final act of testimony that ultimately refused to be silenced, reaching out across the decades to reclaim their story from the ashes. The land remembered, the letter spoke, and Oakhaven, finally, knew peace, albeit a peace forever tinged with the shadow of what happened in 1976, a shadow that urged them, always, to remember.